They believed they could achieve independence. There are 8 fugitives. Every element had been prepared. The pilfered car, the secret safes, the new identities waiting on the other side of the border. They would stop at nothing to vanish. That's why they didn't hesitate when they saw a lone woman running the trails. In their escape, she was but another victim and pawn. She appeared to be an easy prey, bruised and worn out. However, looks can be deceiving. They were unaware that they had just captured a Delta Force commander who had completed more than 20 successful operations in the world's most brutal conflict zones. Hunter would become hunted as she fought her way back from the edge of a simple kidnapping that would grow into a national manhunt. The once-invincible men would see their meticulously planned strategies fall apart. Their allies were dissolved one by one, and their safe places were compromised. There is more to this tale than a woman surviving in the face of overwhelming adversity. In this tale, 8 vicious criminals believed they had triumphed until they discovered they had abducted the most heinous person imaginable. Please let us know where you are watching from and remember to subscribe before we continue. Maintaining a steady beat, Alexis Carter pushed herself harder as she ran along the dirt trail. She had been walking the trail for more than an hour, keeping up her pace while the fresh morning air filled her lungs. In all directions, the national park extended for miles. It was quiet, with only the woodland surrounding her. Separated. The appeal had included such isolation. Throughout her years in the service, she was always surrounded by people and never allowed her guard to drop. Running allowed her the time and space she needed to reflect and forget. However, something didn't feel right. A shadow slipped between the trees, and she saw movement to her right. She maintained a steady rhythm and controlled breathing without reacting. She had learned to trust her instincts, but she wasn't expecting danger or carrying any weapons. Only minutes before, the noises of insects and birds had filled the woodland. It was quiet now. Ahead, off the trail, a black SUV was parked close to the tree line at an unusual angle. The door of the driver was open. Pretending to check her watch, she slowed. The license plate was hardly visible due to the dust covering the car. Although there was nobody inside, she could make out other people moving close to the woods. Then she heard footsteps coming from behind her. A man was already lunging at her when she turned. He staggered forward as Alexis sidestepped and changed her weight. He was tall, with big, tattooed arms and an unshaven, tanned face. Before she could register him, 2 other men appeared from the trees, obstructing the path. From behind the SUV, another emerged. In all, there were 8 of them. She assessed them rapidly. Torn and filthy prison uniforms combined with pilfered civilian clothing. Some packed hunting knives, crowbars, pipes, and homemade weaponry. They appeared to have been evading capture for days, but that did not lessen their threat level. A man stepped forward, his hair slicked back. Despite being thinner than the others, he exuded confidence in his demeanor. He grinned. "You don't have to run. You are just what we required." Alexis's body stiffened. One thing was obvious, even though she had no idea who they were or what they wanted. They had been anticipating her arrival. She was determined not to be taken without a fight. Although Alexis maintained a neutral posture and steady breathing, her mind was already assessing the circumstances. There were 8 men, all of them stiff and forceful, all of them expecting her to do something. They were encircling her, obstructing her escape behind and cutting off the way forward. Although it wasn't a careless formation, it also lacked professionalism. These were not folks with training. Something else had hardened them. In prison, the leader took just enough of a step forward to make himself known as the boss. He had the appearance of someone who believed he was untouchable because of his slender frame, worn leather jacket, and combed hair. Everything she needed to know was revealed to her by the way the others hovered behind him, anticipating his response. It was him who made the decisions. He said casually, "You're a long way from help." Even though his tone was calm and almost kind, Alexis knew better than to fall for it. It's not exactly a good location to be by yourself, is it? Alexis didn't wince or turn away. She had been in too many perilous places for a few men who believed their numbers made them powerful to scare her. It looks like you're the one with the issue, she responded calmly. That made some of them laugh, but it was a laugh that stopped short of their eyes. The leader tilted his head slightly and grinned. You have no idea what's happening, do you? He pointed languidly at the SUV parked next to the trees. Make a guess. She didn't have to. She had worked it out already. She said, you got out of jail. The grin got bigger. Yes, exactly. There were 8 of us. New. Would you not be aware of it? The state is on high alert, damn it. There are police officers around. Obstacles. Patrols. This welcoming wagon isn't exactly what we were hoping for. And I should be concerned because... The smile on the man's face widened, but now it was piercing. Since we require a means of passage. Someone is required to assist us in overcoming the obstacles. Let the police officers pass. And take a look at that. In the proper location. At the right moment. One of the other men crossed his arms. He was a stocky man with a fading black eye and a crooked nose. We should just take her belongings and go on, in my opinion. Do you really believe that we will simply pass a roadblock in this state? The leader retaliated by pointing to their tattoos from prison in their mismatched, pilfered attire. We must have a compelling cause for being there. She is it. Another man eyed Alexis and murmured, she's a runner. He was wiry and emaciated, with a sunburned face. The type of man who has been living only off his anxieties. She won't help us get past the police. She is more than just a runner. The voice rumbled deeper. Alexis cocked her head in the direction of the speaker. A huge, thick-built man with a shaven head. The others were smaller than him. Wider. The type of individual who didn't require a firearm. Because the weapon was his body. He had been keeping a careful eye on her. Alexis was fully aware of what he had witnessed. The way her feet had remained in place. How she hadn't freaked out. The way she had assessed them as soon as they were in her immediate vicinity. He was aware of it. The leader looked at him. Shadow, do you want to share something? Travis Shadow Walker, the large man, kept his gaze fixed on Alexis. She's not afraid. The others appeared unsure of how to interpret that. Alexis remained silent, allowing the situation to unfold. Allowing them to struggle with the reality that her response wasn't what they had anticipated. After a time, the leader dismissed it and remarked, "Don't matter. She doesn't need to be afraid. All she needs to do is cooperate." Alexis let out a slow breath. "What if I don't?" With a groan, the leader combed his slick back hair. "Don't make things more difficult than it has to be, lady." Alexis remained still. That isn't a response. A younger man, whose nervous energy was radiating from him, stepped up just as the leader was about to reply. "What happens if she notifies the police?" There was a hint of panic in his voice. "What happens if she surrenders us?" The leader glanced over his shoulder and cocked his head slightly. "Are you going to release her?" After hesitating, the younger man shook his head. "Man, I'm just saying. This is foolish. The plan does not include this. It was time for us to leave. Keep quiet. Move without heat if you can. This is a request for heat. She is our savior." The leader said it again, his tone growing impatient. "We take her. She helps us overcome the obstacles. After that, we dump her. Easy. Where should I dump her?" The younger man faltered a little. The leader turned completely now, his smirk gone, his posture changing. "Damn you, you ask too many questions. The trembling man swallowed hard but didn't continue to protest. Alexis kept a tight eye on them, hearing every change in tone and break in their harmony. The younger one felt scared. He was not entirely dedicated to this. Weakness was implied. The leader turned back to Alexis and said, "Look. There is no need for a conflict. You stroll along with us with ease. No one is harmed. After we pass the checkpoint, you continue on your journey." For a moment, Alexis didn't think so. She had heard variants of that remark before, and she had experienced similar circumstances previously. It was never that easy. Or, the leader went on, "You can quickly make this really messy." Alexis maintained a regular breathing pattern. She sensed the tension building around them, a tense situation where anything may happen at any time. They were anticipating her response, anticipating her dread or obedience. Rather, she raised her chin just enough to look directly into the leader's eyes. "I believe we both understand that I won't be going anywhere with you." There was silence between them. The commander shook his head and clicked his tongue as if she had just let him down. "Shame," he whispered. Then suddenly one of the men sprang forward. Alexis shifted as soon as the man attacked. She sidestepped fluidly as his momentum propelled him past, twisting her body just as his arms reached for her. She quickly took advantage of his unsteady footing by driving her elbow into the side of his jaw. Before he could recover, she delivered a swift, accurate blow to his throat after his head suddenly wrenched back. His legs gave way under him and he fell face first into the earth, choking out a moan. There was silence for half a second. Then everything suddenly blew apart. "Grab her." Another man grabbed at her from the side, and Alexis was immediately on the move, her body twisting. He bent over as she ripped her arm away and pushed her knee into his stomach, felt his air leave him. He sprawled forward as she struck the back of his neck with both hands down in a powerful hammer blow before he could recover. He groaned when he hit the floor. She didn't, however, pause to check if he stood up. She was running already. She had no intention of running away. They were huddled together, but she knew they would always pursue her. She wanted space and needed to isolate them, so they tried to grab her all at once. The trail was tiny, lined with thick trees, and the ground was rough, despite the impenetrable forest. By cutting sharp angles and darting between trunks, Alexis took advantage of it and made them react rather than plan. She heard them yelling as they crashed after her through the undergrowth. "Stop her. Get your ass moving. She's running." Immediately to her right, a branch snapped. The stocky man with the busted lip, Rust, attacked from the side as Alexis turned. In an instant, she swept his legs out from under him by placing her foot and lowering herself. With a strangled grunt, he struck the ground hard, and before he could get back up, Alexis was on her feet again. Behind her, she heard footsteps pounding and the distinct sound of breathing too close. An arm swung toward her head and she ducked, just avoiding it. Twisting, she pressed her elbow into the assailant's ribs. With a grunt, he staggered back, but from the opposite side, another set of hands grabbed for her. They were adjusting now, attempting to anticipate her motions as she twisted away, moving quickly. She moves too quickly. Someone yelled. "Stop talking and take her." Ahead, the tree line broke into a tiny clearing, giving them just enough room to spread out once more, as Alexis could see. She needed to decide. Continue to move while staying in the middle of the woods, or turn and take out another one before they enclose her. Up ahead, a shadow moved among the trees. She was being approached by someone. She changed her direction, slanting slightly to the left, but she continued to run. She saw the man waiting for her as soon as she emerged from the clearing. He was wiry, lean, sunburned, and had a stiff yet shaky attitude. He was prepared to cut her off, but he was caught off guard by how quickly she closed the gap. After pushing him to react as Alexis feinted to the left, she snapped her foot into his knee. She threw her shoulder into his chest, sending him flying to the ground as he stumbled and yelled. She could hear shouts coming from behind her and knew that the others were quickly catching up. Something crashed into her side as she turned to move again. A shadow, a solid bulk with all the force and sheer strength. She was knocked down by the impact. As his weight pressed down on her, his hands clamped onto her wrists, trapping them into the soil, and she hit the ground hard, the breath rushing from her lungs. He snarled, his hands tightening, "Enough of this." Alexis twisted and strained to break free, but he was too heavy and too huge. No matter how well-trained she was, his size alone was enough to keep her confined. Keep her alive. Dominic's voice broke the commotion. We must keep her alive. Shadow let out a quick exhale and adjusted his hold, but his grip remained firm. He mumbled, "She's got some fight." Nearly revered. Alexis didn't hear. She was seeing how he relaxed up just enough now that he believed she was finished, and how his equilibrium changed little when he spoke. Just enough to give him the impression that she was giving up. She made her body slack. Less than a second passed. Shadow's minor shift in weight caused an immediate reaction from Alexis. She threw her entire weight into the movement, turning violently and snapping her hips high. She was able to tear one arm free because he lost his equilibrium just enough. He jerked back reflexively as she pressed her forearm into his throat. She threw her knee as hard as she could into his ribs as his grip relaxed. Shadow recoiled and growled. She wasn't yet free, though. Before she could fully escape, hands seized her from behind and pulled her upright. She twisted her body and lashed out. But now there were too numerous. She was being pulled, grabbed, and held down by too many hands. She caught one of them in the shin with a kick. However, it was insufficient. She had caused them pain and made them earn it. They had her now, though. As she stood there, breathing heavily, her muscles still tense as if she would lash out again, Dominic walked nearer, brushed off his jacket, and watched her with mild amusement. He shook his head and remarked, "Lady, you're making this really hard. There's no use in fighting right now. We're bringing you along. It's as simple as that." Alexis remained silent. She simply continued to breathe, observe, and wait. For now, they had her. However, they had yet to triumph. Alexis peered down the drop ahead, controlling her breathing and ignoring the fire in her muscles. The slope was covered in loose dirt and the rock face was steep and irregular, with jagged edges. It wasn't impossible, though. The bottom landing was rocky, covered in dense foliage and littered with shattered rock. However, she could handle it. There was nothing she could do. She could tell how close they were by the sound of smashing footsteps behind her and the frenzied cries of the men who were having a hard time keeping up. Someone shouted, their voice labored with effort, "She has nowhere left to go." She turned her head just enough to see them coming out of the trees, and took a step back, her foot just touching the edge. Leading the way was Dominic, his jacket filthy, his face contorted with annoyance. Shadow, Rust, and Blade were right behind him, all of them exhausted, their annoyance simmering beneath the surface. Rust was obviously favoring one side, limping slightly from where she had hit him earlier, while Blade's hands were still clasped around the revolver, his grasp too tight, his stance anxious. Shadow was the only one who appeared totally undisturbed. It was evident from his steady breathing and keen eyes that he had more energy left than the others. Dominic stopped, rolling his shoulders and shaking his head to release the tension before he let out a breath. "You made things more difficult than they had to be. Lady, you'll get credit for it. You sprint as fast as a deer." Even though his voice was lighter than his face, it was clear that he was exhausted. Alexis had shown them that this was more complicated than they had all anticipated. She simply kept looking at their faces, seeing how they moved and positioned themselves, without saying anything or responding. Blade felt jittery and continued to turn to Dominic for guidance. Rust wanted this to be over with and was impatient. Knowing that he could intervene if it came to using physical force, Shadow waited and let them handle it. Dominic nodded to himself, letting out another harsh breath and straightening his jacket. Normally, we would make you an offer at this point. You give up fighting. This is made simple by you. Perhaps we don't need to be too harsh with you, but I believe we've moved past that. Without turning around, he stepped forward again and raised a hand to the others. Grab her, please. Alexis surged off the ground and threw herself over the edge the moment they made contact. She was already in the air, tucking her body as her boots struck the steep hill, but shouts erupted behind her. Dirt and loose stone slipped beneath her as the collision delivered a stinging jolt through her legs, but she rolled into the motion, absorbing the energy and maintaining her momentum as she struck the ground hard. Despite the protests from her muscles, she continued. With more shouts from above, she pushed forward instantly, running through the rocky ground and forcing herself to hurry before they could find another way down. She leaped. Move about. She found cover in the rugged terrain, which was covered in shattered rock and trees. She hurried swiftly, swerving through the brush, being silent, and listening for any noise that would indicate how rapidly they were pursuing. She briefly thought she had finally gained some genuine distance, but the delusion was short-lived. She felt a new rush of adrenaline when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. Shadow was going through the trees at a frightening pace when she turned her head just enough. He was gaining quickly and had handled the dive better than the rest, his hefty physique unfazed by the jarring landing. Like the others, he wasn't only motivated by rage or adrenaline, instead, he was systematic and efficient, following her like a predator aware that its victim was already worn out. Despite her body screaming for her to stop, Alexis gritted her teeth and pushed harder. A low branch, just high enough to utilize, spanned her route ahead. As Shadow reached for her, she grasped it without slowing down and used the momentum to swing forward, planting her feet on a thick tree trunk and launching off. She had already pushed herself forward, landing hard and rolling before taking off again, but he rushed, his fingertips grazing the air where her arm had been. The terrain was uneven, the roots heavy and knotted, and the woodland ahead was deeper. She could turn this to her advantage if she could just keep moving, if she could push them farther away from their car, farther into unfamiliar territory. There was a gunshot. Bark exploded against the tree next to Alexis, sending splinters flying in all directions as she barely had time to react. As Blade's voice reverberated through the trees, she continued to move, hurling herself behind the closest cover, her heart thumping. "You're a moron." Dominic sounded enraged. "We need her alive," I added. "I didn't have her in my sights." Blade responded with a shout. He spoke in a panic. "All I wanted to do was get her to stop. You will permanently halt her if you continue firing in that manner." Alexis steadied herself against the coarse bark and let out a breath through her nose. They were armed. That made a difference. She had been able to keep moving forward before, but now she needed to exercise greater caution. Although she was not yet caught, everything would change in their favor if they were to get a lucky shot or put her in a precarious situation. Her body resisted every step as she pushed herself forward once more. She saw that the trees were thinning out and the ground underneath her was becoming more rocky. A drop. Just ahead, a 20-foot vertical cliff was carved into the terrain by the dried-out river, and the land abruptly cut off. There was no simple path down, and the bottom was ragged, full of heavy brush and loose stone. Her head racing, her breath heavy, she slid to a stop. Her shoes thundered on the dirt as she heard them approaching from behind. Her alternatives were dwindling. She halted. Rust's breathing was labored, and his voice was now closer. "She's in a tight spot." Alexis's eyes darted from the edge to the figures approaching her through the trees as she turned slightly. Vinny was first through the brush, and when he spotted the cliff behind her, he smiled again. A few feet away, he paused, looked over the edge, and then shook his head in amusement. "You simply aren't sure when to give up, are you?" Her body was screaming for her to move, and she was out of time as she clenched her fists, her muscles aching. Vinny waved a hand and murmured, "All right, enough of this. Take her, Shadow." Shadow rushed forward, his enormous form quickly reducing the distance before she could even respond. She turned, attempting to move and distract him, but her body was too slow and exhausted. She struggled, kicked, and battled against his hold as his arms wrapped around her and pulled her back. However, he was too powerful. At last, with his hands on his knees, Rust leaned forward and mumbled, "Can we now bind her?" Vinny nodded and moved forward. "Sure, before she tries something else, do it." Rust took a length of rope out of his pocket and moved in to bind Alexis's wrists, causing her muscles to stiffen. She compelled herself to breathe and maintain her composure while looking for any remaining gap that would allow her to escape. Nothing. Despite her best efforts to run, fight, and drag them through every challenge, she was ultimately overcome by fatigue and the numbers. Exhaling, Vinny brushed the dirt from his jacket. What a pursuit. He smirked slowly and knowingly at her, "You nearly made me work for it." Nearly. The rough fibers of the rope cut into Alexis's skin as it tightened around her wrists, but she remained silent. This time, she had lost. She wasn't finished yet, though. Rust pulled the rope tighter, tying her hands behind her back as the coarse fibers dug into Alexis's wrists, causing her to tighten her jaw. Even though her limbs hurt and her muscles were being pulled by fatigue, her respiration remained steady. The weight of their looks, which were filled with annoyance, rage, and something worse beneath the surface, was palpable to her. They were not yet enjoying the fact that they had her. Vinny rolled his shoulders and murmured, "All right," before turning to face the others. "Come on, let's get her out of here." With unwavering power, Shadow tightened his hold on her arm and pulled her forward, pulling her across the uneven terrain. For a brief while, Alexis's boots sank into the mud despite her instincts, but the effort was in vain. With her body still recuperating from the hunt, she was hardly able to stand, and the last thing she needed was to expend what little energy she still had. She allowed them to drag her along while pushing herself to pay attention to every detail and maintaining a slow breathing rate. She could see the route ahead opening up, leading to the location where they had abandoned their stolen car, even if the jungle was still dense around them. From the beginning, they had been working to get her back to it. They got what they desired now. Blade continued to hold the weapon, his fingers fluttering over the handle while he shot cautious looks at her. He had yet to overcome his nervousness and regain the arrogant composure that the others possessed. She could tell from his stance that his jaw was tense and his hands were clammy. She had fought back, which he hadn't anticipated. Rust wiped the perspiration from his forehead and gave Vinny a weary look. "Now what the devil is the plan? We've wasted enough time fumbling in the woods, and that barricade is still there." Vinny took a moment to respond. With his hands on his hips and a minute to reflect, he led the way back to the car, walking ahead of them. He was not as composed as he was acting. His shoulders remained just too stiff, and Alexis could see it in the way his fingers trembled. This had not gone as he had hoped. And finally he said, "We'll sort it out." His voice trailed off. "However, we will not abandon her. She remains our best chance to overcome the obstacle." Rust shook his head and exhaled in frustration. "Yes. And what if any tale you make doesn't convince the police? What if they begin to ask us questions that we are unable to respond to?" Vinny stopped moving. He pivoted on his heel, his face piercing as he turned to face Rust. Then, he added plainly, "We convince them to trust us. Or we figure out another method. In any case, we won't be leaving her. For that, we've come too far." Alexis remained silent, allowing the words to register. They still believed they could utilize her, therefore they were keeping her alive. She had time, then. Enough, but not much. Shadow pulled her forward with another firm pull on her arm, his hold a quiet warning not to put him to the test. She continued to walk, keeping a few paces ahead of Rust and Blade as they returned to the area where the vehicle was waiting. The car was partially obscured by dense vegetation and parked slightly off the trail. Now that she was closer, though, she could see the rust eating at the edges and the dents down the sides. It was not a trustworthy means of escape. Looking for anything that would slow them down, she counted the exits as she examined the surroundings. Not yet, no openings right now. With his patience running low, Shadow pushed her in the direction of the van's side door. Enter. After a moment of hesitation that caused him to frown, Alexis climbed inside the car and ducked her head as she slid down the floor close to the rear. In order to feel the tightness of the knot and look for any give in the strands, she gently tested the rope around her wrists. Nothing. She was followed by the others, who slammed the door behind them. The deep rumble vibrated through the frame as Rust started the engine and Dominic settled into the passenger seat. Sweat and frustration filled the oppressive air inside. Dominic swiveled in his chair and fixed her with his piercing eyes. He said, "You're really quiet now. It's fantastic to see that you're finally understanding." Alexis's countenance was unreadable when she met his gaze. He grinned, "I was just thinking." "Yes. What is it about?" She spoke evenly while leaning her head back against the metal wall. "How will this end?" There was silence for a while. Then Rust threw the van into reverse and snorted from the driver's seat, shaking his head. "Lady, do you really believe you're going to get out of this?" Alexis remained silent. She was not required to. She could tell that the group had already considered it because of the tension that was beginning to build. They were already making mistakes, but they had her for the time being. All she needed to do was be prepared for the next one. Rust pushed the van over each dip and bump in the landscape, and the engine growled as it rattled along the uneven dirt road. Sweat and frustration clung to every square inch of the claustrophobic enclosure, and the oppressive heat within made the air thick. With her wrists still securely bound behind her, Alexis maintained a relaxed stance, her head leaning against the chilly metal wall. Her muscles ached from the battle, the fight, and the pursuit, and every change in the vehicle's motion sent a dull agony through her body. However, her attention was on them and not the agony. Sitting in the front passenger seat, Vinny glanced out of the window with an enigmatic expression on his face. He was probably cycling through their limited options, lost in thought. Rust's hands were clenched around the steering wheel, beating nervously against the tattered leather. With the revolver still in his hand and his knee hopping with frantic energy, Blade sat on the floor close to the side entrance. Behind Alexis, taking up more room than anyone else, stood Shadow. He watched her intently, his arms folded across his chest. The weight of their predicament was bearing down on them as the heavy, tight stillness dragged on. It was Blade who broke first. "Man, what's the fucking plan?" His grip tightened on the revolver, his voice high-strung and restless. "They will be crawling all over the highways by now, but we have already overcome the first obstacle. We can't ignore another one and drive right by it." Vinny shook his head, dragged his fingers down his face, and exhaled slowly. "We will work things out. Before we hit the next one, we still have time." "What is the time for?" With his frustration showing, Rust lost his temper. "It's time to be discovered. We must stop playing around. This isn't a trivial little diversion. We're deeply involved. They are hunting us, not merely searching for us." As though she weren't listening, Alexis listened intently, breathing evenly and keeping her eyes half-lidded. However, she was. She heard the quiver of Blade's hand around the revolver each time Rust spoke, the way his voice veered toward hysteria. Their group was already beginning to fall apart, their desperation tearing at what little loyalty they still had. Vinny swiveled in his chair, his eyes alert. "Do you want to freak out? Do you want to start complaining about how ugly it is? Feel free, Rust. But please stop talking and give me time to consider, unless you have a better plan." Without protesting, Rust drew in a deep breath and tightened his grasp on the steering wheel. Shadow's voice was deliberate and slow when he eventually spoke. The girl was still ours. They were jostled violently when the van struck a pothole, and Rust steadied the wheel once more. Alexis sensed the change in the mood as Shadow's words lingered in the air, heavy with insinuation. Vinny rubbed his brow and moaned. Indeed, she is still available, and we will continue to use her to break through the upcoming blockage. That remains the same. Blade sneered. How on earth is that expected to function? If we have a woman in the back who is tied up, the police won't just let us drive through. Do you believe they won't inquire? Vinny's grin reappeared, but it stayed out of his eyes. They won't witness her restrained. We make her appear to be with us by cleaning her up. She might be a hitchhiker. She might be a girlfriend. She might be complicit. Whatever story we choose, as long as she cooperates, doesn't matter. At last, Alexis raised her head slightly and opened her eyes fully. What happens if I don't? The van became silent once more. Vinny's sneer twisted into something colder as he turned to face her. Then we create you. Alexis stared at him, unwavering, unmoved. Do you believe that pressing me will help you overcome a challenge? When I look like I've been fighting for my life, do you really think the police won't notice? Rust laughed. We can change your clothes, clean you up, and fix your face. It's not that difficult. Alexis's voice was calm and almost inquisitive as she cocked her head slightly. And if I speak? Blade shifted uneasily, his fingers flexing against the gun's grip while his knee continued to bounce. The slightest hint of doubt flickered in Vinny's eyes as his smirk twitched. But Shadow didn't falter. Then we murder you. The weight of the words pressed into the already oppressive air as they fell. Blade's knee ceased to bounce. Rust tightened his hold on the wheel and let out a sharp sigh through his nose. After a brief moment of hesitation, even Vinny managed to re-establish his smirk. Alexis did not recoil. She simply let them settle with the truth of what Shadow had just stated by breathing steadily and slowly. The issue is that, isn't it? Her voice was low yet steady as she whispered. You maintain me, you lose your leverage, and I become a liability if you murder me. I'm hazardous to you no matter what you do. Vinny let out a breath and shook his head as if dismissing it. You enjoy listening to your own voice, don't you? Alexis remained silent. She simply leaned back against the wall and watched as the van's motion lulled her into silence, revealing how they had changed and how their strategy wasn't as solid as they had hoped. Blade shifted uneasily and murmured something beneath his breath. Rust's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he rubbed a palm over his face. Pretending not to be shaken, Vinny continued to face forward, his eyes fixed on the road. Shadow was the only one who didn't change, still, steady, and silent. The cracks were getting bigger. Although Alexis wasn't yet free, she wasn't defeated either. All she had to do was wait for them to split open with the next crack. As they reached the main road, the van shook over uneven pavement, the worn-out suspension making every bump feel worse than it actually was. Although Alexis remained motionless with her arms tied behind her and her back against the metal wall, her mind was active all the time. Every change in their voice, every glint of doubt, and every pause between them was a new fissure growing. The numbers were in their possession. The gun was with them. Her hands were restrained behind her back. However, they lacked authority. Not at all. Rust's shoulders were stiff and his knuckles were white as he gripped the driving wheel too hard. His initial annoyance had evolved into something more. Fatigue, possibly even uncertainty. Blade's tense energy didn't go away, but he was still holding the revolver. It was growing worse, if anything. He wasn't made for this and wasn't accustomed to it. He was the type of guy who spoke a lot but broke down when things got tough. Sitting with his arms crossed, breathing steadily, and his presence weighty in the already small room, Shadow was unreadable. The opinions of the others didn't concern him. All he could think about was what was ahead. There was Dominic after that. Dominic continued to smirk and act as though he understood everything. But the anguish behind his eyes was visible to Alexis. He wasn't the strongest or wisest, so he wasn't the leader. The rest of them needed someone to give them instructions, so he took charge. However, now that things were not going as planned, he was at a loss for how to keep them in line. Alexis watched them as she gently exhaled and leaned her head slightly against the metal wall. The vehicle was tense, and for a while the only sound they could hear was the hum of the road below. At last, she murmured, "You're all quiet." Her tone was measured and quiet. "Did you not have a contingency plan?" Although Dominic didn't look back, she could see his jaw tighten. "Yes, we have plans." "All right. Don't stress over that." "Do you?" Alexis asked in a steady voice. "Because it appears to me that you are making stuff up as you go along." Blade's knee bounced once more as he exhaled sharply. "Keep quiet." Alexis didn't even give him a glance. She continued to watch Dominic, observing the way his fingers tapped his leg as if he was trying to figure out what to do next while maintaining control of the conversation. "You've overcome one obstacle, but there will be more," she added, exerting just enough pressure to cause them to move and to keep them unstable. "You're already being followed by police. Your faces are by now all over the place, even if it's not your van yet. It's impossible to enter a gas station and not be recognized." From the driver's seat, Rust scuffed, but it was uncertain. "We've dealt with worse." Alexis clarified, "You've handled worse in prison, where you knew the rules, where you had a system, and where people were looking out for you. That's not out here with you. No defenses, no fences, no backup codes. You no longer operate a gang in a controlled environment. All you're doing is running. Quiet." The way Rust breathed through his nose as if to drown out what she was saying, and the way Blade's fingers trembled on the rifle, she could feel the shift taking place. She was familiar with the sound of doubt. Dominic gave a low, forced laugh. "Don't you enjoy the sound of your own voice?" Alexis paid him no attention. "Already, you are betraying one another." Blade's grip tightened as he moved. "That is untrue." "Really?" Alexis looked at him at last and inquired. "Because, as far as I can see, you are not in the lead, even if you are the one with the gun. Not even the next course of action is up to you. You're simply waiting for instructions, hoping that no one would notice that you're not making any decisions for yourself." Alexis noticed a glimmer of something in Blade's face as his jaw tensed. Rust murmured, "He's doing fine," but even he didn't seem to be persuaded. Alexis returned her focus to Dominic and watched him exhale through his nose while he forced himself to maintain his smile. He shook his head and added, "That's a nice trick. It is not going to work to try to cause trouble." Something that wasn't quite a smile twisted Alexis's lips. "Are you certain?" Rust swerved to miss a pothole, causing the van to shake violently, sending a severe jerk through the cabin. In order to test the ropes once more and determine whether they had loosened at all over the previous hour, Alexis allowed her body to move with the movement. They were still clutching in tight, but that didn't mean they couldn't break. She watched and waited, breathing slowly. Shadow murmured behind her, "I don't care what she says." He spoke in a flat, serene voice, totally unconcerned by anything going on around him. "We follow the plan and overcome the next obstacle. We then determine our next course of action." Although Dominic appeared to nod in agreement, Alexis saw a change in his expression. He wasn't being followed by Shadow. Now Shadow was calling himself. Rust shook his head and ran a palm down his face. "Yes, brilliance, and what comes next? Do you believe we simply vanish? Do you believe that we will cross the border and lead happy lives?" Dominic let out a harsh sigh. "We continue to move. We do that." Rust laughed drearily, without humor. "It's not a strategy. It's merely stalling. You have no idea what will happen next, do you? Alexis remained quiet as she observed Rust's stiff hands on the steering wheel and Blade's constant shifting of eyes between Dominic and the gun. She had sown the seed, and now she had to wait, as if he had lost his sense of whom to listen to. The cracks were getting bigger. They would soon break, but not yet. The engine of the van hummed softly. As they rolled onto the highway, a constant vibration shook the floor. Long sections of road that cross. Ed across open fields and sporadic towns now surrounded them, leaving the forest behind. With her shoulders taut from prolonged immobility and her wrists still bound behind her back, Alexis maintained a regular breathing pattern. Since the last conversation, Dominic had not said much. His grin was vanished, his brain straining too hard to think of a sensible idea. They all realized they were getting closer to the next obstacle. The tension in the van had increased and was weighing them all down like a burden. Rust's shoulders were slumped as if he were bracing himself for an emergency, and his fingers were wrapped too tightly around the wheel. Once more, Blade was twitching with the rifle, bouncing his knee, and looking at Alexis every few minutes as if he thought she would do something. As usual, Shadow sat quietly, his presence serving more as a warning. At last, Dominic let out a harsh sigh and combed through his hair. "Okay," he mumbled. "We follow my instructions exactly. We tidy her up and restore her natural appearance. No struggle, no marks, no restraints." He swiveled in his chair and met Alexis's gaze. "You will be sitting in the passenger seat. Unless I say it, you don't speak. You appear composed, you smile, and you don't act foolishly. If I do," Dominic's smirk returns, albeit a smaller, more forced one. Alexis held his stare steadily. "After that, we'll have to make sure you don't have any opportunity to speak." Rust shook his head and muttered a chuckle. "This is absurd. Is everything we have at stake for this? Do you genuinely believe it will work?" Dominic glared at him. "Unless you have a more brilliant idea. Turn off your phone and go for a drive." Without arguing, Rust murmured something beneath his breath. Although Alexis's face was unreadable, she was already making changes to her plan on the inside. It was dangerous, but she could handle it. They desired her in the front seat, out of sight but under control. She had an opening because of that. Dominic's gaze returned to Shadow. "Untie her slowly, though." Shadow's big hands worked carefully as he reached for the ropes, preventing her from moving an inch. Alexis relaxed the tension by rolling her shoulders as soon as her wrists were free. She didn't do anything more than that, though. Knowing that any abrupt movement would make them tense, she remained motionless. Blade tightened his hold on the revolver. "This bothers me." Dominic, obviously impatient, let out a breath through his nose. "Blade, you don't enjoy anything. Simply maintain your composure and let me take care of it." Alexis was pushed forward by Shadow. "Get moving." Her muscles were so rigid that it was obvious how much time she had been restrained in the rear when she slid into the passenger seat. Dominic pulled a rag from the glove compartment. "Wash your face." Taking the cloth, Alexis wiped away the perspiration and grime that the struggle had left on her skin. Although the bruises that were developing along her jaw were inevitable, they weren't noticeable enough to cause suspicion right away. She shook off the remainder of the stiffness in her limbs by wiping her hands against the fabric of her pants while moving slowly and deliberately and avoiding eye contact. Blade continued to mutter to himself. "This is not good. We ought to have taken a different route." Dominic's expression tightened as he turned in his chair. "Where do you run? Do you think we'll be saved by back roads? We either pass through this barrier without incident or we try to avoid patrols for the next few hours till we are at a loss for what to do. So shut up and prepare yourself." Rust didn't argue, but his face was tense with worry and his hold on the wheel jerked a little. The road ahead seemed broad and vast, but Alexis could already make out the roadblock and its flashing lights in the distance. Dominic rolled his shoulders and smoothed his jacket as if he were assuming his role. He looked at Alexis, trying to convey the illusion with a slight return of his smirk. "Have fun, my love. We're nearly free at home." Alexis did not respond. She waited, watching the road ahead. Uniformed officers stood at regular intervals to scan every vehicle that came through the slow-moving line of cars that led up to the blockage. While some conversed with drivers, others kept a tight eye out for any indications of trouble. Rust took a deep breath. "Let's get started." Dominic lowered his voice just enough for Alexis to hear him as he leaned slightly in her direction. "Keep in mind that you won't enjoy what happens if you make one mistake." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The van crept closer, rolling ahead. Alexis maintained a calm stance and a neutral expression. Just one more traveler in one more car. They moved closer to the driver's side window as the police in front of them waved them on. Rust faked a smile that fell short of his eyes. "Officer, good afternoon." The man glanced into the van and nodded briefly. "Where are you all going?" "Vacation with the family." Before Rust could stutter out his response, Dominic responded with ease. "After encountering some heavy traffic earlier, I had to make a small detour." The officer hardly gave him a glance, but you know how it goes. He was already staring at Alexis. She sensed it immediately. The hesitation, the deliberation, the small squinting of his eyes. Her head tilted slightly as she forced herself to breathe normally, as if she were just waiting, unconcerned. "Miss, are you okay?" The officer asked in a courteous but slightly acerbic tone. With a tiny, effortless smile, Alexis inclined her shoulders slightly in Dominic's direction as if it were instinctive. "Yes, I'm simply exhausted. Been traveling for some time." The cops gazed straight to Dominic, who shrugged casually. "You are aware of the length of the drives. After the first few hours, she doesn't engage in much talk." Alexis could hear Rust's barely contained gasp and sense Blade's anxiousness in the rear seat. Knowing full well that Shadow's silence was unreadable, even to her, she dared not glance at him. The officer stayed a while longer, looking around the van and noticing Blade's anxious twitches. Alexis felt Blade's fingers tighten on the revolver out of sight, yet her heart continued to beat steadily. The entire scheme would fail if he even made a slight movement. With a voice that broke the silence, another cop moved toward the window. "Is this the final one?" The first officer nodded after giving them one last glance. "Yes, proceed." As he put the van in gear and rolled along at a steady rate, Rust released a loud sigh. "Avoid going too quickly or too slow." The atmosphere inside the vehicle abruptly altered as soon as they passed the checkpoint. Vinny let out a breath and wiped his face. "Told you it would be successful." Rust didn't respond. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road and his fingers on the wheel as if he was waiting for something to go wrong. Blade shook his head and laughed nervously. It was far too near. Shadow remained silent as usual. Alexis sat motionless, breathing steadily, her thoughts already planning the next move. Although they had succeeded, they were still not safe. The tension within the vehicle had not subsided even after they had been on the road for more than an hour. It had gotten worse, if anything. Alexis remained motionless in the passenger seat, observing the minute changes in the dynamics of the group. Vinny had calmed down as soon as they'd crossed the checkpoint, but the others hadn't. Shadow was still unreadable, Rust had not let go of the wheel, and Blade was still tense. Now, though, she sensed someone else standing behind her. Someone moved in the van's farthest corner, making a loud thump. Then another. Since the outset, she had been aware that there were more of them. There are 8 in all. She hadn't seen them all, though. Some had remained silent and concealed in the darkness. The remainder of them now started to move into view as the van turned along a lonely, cracked road that was encircled only by overgrown grass and a few trees. First, wiry and hollow-cheeked, Grady leaned forward, tapping his knee with his fingertips. He smiled at Alexis slowly and thinly, as if he had already chosen how this would end. I assumed you would ultimately meet the rest of us. Carl breathed slowly beside him. His face was unreadable, his arms folded across his wide chest. The man with the scar along his cheek, Doyle, hardly gave her a glance. His hands were on his lap as if he was waiting for a reason to use them, and his knuckles were cracked. Rust looked at Dominic, then into the rearview mirror. Now we have to deal with her. Still holding the revolver tightly in his lap, Blade shifted uneasily. Back there, in the woods, we ought to have abandoned her. We are trapped with her now. Alexis simply listened without moving or responding. Dominic let out a breath and wiped his face. Calm down. We're nearly finished. Rust exhaled in frustration. You believe that after we release her, she will simply remain silent? She is too knowledgeable. Alexis noticed the small change in the van, the way Blade tensed up, the quick glance between Carl and Doyle. Grady muttered a little laugh. But she's got a point. Are you really going to let her go? Blade's knee bounced again as he gulped hard. We are not required to. Rust glared at him. Are you going to soften now? With his fingers tapping his thigh, Dominic exhaled slowly as he considered it. Her speaking is not a concern of mine. We'll be long gone by the time she gets anywhere. Carl mumbled, unless someone finds her first. Rust swung around in his chair, his annoyance exploding. If we deal with it now, no one will discover her. There was silence in the van. Blade's jaw tightened. You mean? Rust didn't state it directly. He didn't have to, though. Like a heavy stone, the group felt the weight of his remarks. Dominic shook his head and moaned. No, it's too disorganized. The additional heat is unnecessary. Rust laughed. Do you really want to risk it? Grady leaned forward a little and grinned. Let's do it clean, I say. Hurry. Regardless, she's already halfway there. Alexis did not move at all. Dominic let out another breath, more slowly this time. We won't murder her. His tone was decisive. The trouble is unnecessary for us. Here, in the midst of nowhere, we leave her. She will not survive. Rust's jaw tensed, but he did not protest. He desired her death. Blade exhaled slowly, as if he had been suppressing his breath. Is that all? Are we simply abandoning her? Dominic looked at him sharply. Blade paused, unless you want to be the one to pull the trigger. His face showed it to Alexis. He was not designed to make such a choice. Sighing in disappointment, Grady shook his head and said, Okay, but don't come crying later if she shows up again. Dominic refused to accept it. He simply gestured at Shadow. Remove her. Shadow made no hesitation. He tightened his hold on Alexis's arm and pulled her in the direction of the rear doors. She didn't argue. Not quite yet. The smell of moist dirt and aged trees filled the cool air that rushed in as soon as the doors opened. It was an uneven ground, with dense sections of vegetation and exposed roots breaking up the earth. This was no haphazard drop-off. This was what they had anticipated. She tripped into the uneven ground after Shadow pushed her forward, but she caught herself before she could fall to her knees. Doyle moved forward before she could move, putting a length of rope around her wrists once more and effortlessly pulling them behind her back. As she observed the others, Alexis gritted her teeth. Dominic thought as he got out of the van, you should have kept quiet. I'll grant you intelligence. But when you're outnumbered, intelligence is meaningless. Leaning against the van, Grady observed her as if she were a problem that he had already solved. It's a shame. You defended yourself well. Blade swallowed forcefully, his face going white. He didn't approach her or give her a direct glance. He was different from the others. He didn't have the stomach for it, but he wanted her gone. Dominic let out a sigh and wiped his face as if it were a small annoyance. Okay, let's finish this up. With a nod, Rust moved closer while holding a piece of duct tape. Every muscle in Alexis's body strained as she waited for the ideal moment. They weren't going to make it easy, but she wasn't going to let them abandon her out here. Just as Alexis moved, Rust jerked the tape forward and Doyle's hands tightened around her arms. She swung her weight back, smashing Doyle into the van's side and causing him to lose his equilibrium sufficiently to let off. She twisted as soon as she saw the slack, pressing her knee up into his ribs and making him grunt sharply. Dominic responded immediately. He slammed his hand out, knocking the air out of her lungs as it caught her right below the ribcage. She staggered backward at the hit, but she forced herself to stand. Shadow was on the move already. His hands clamped down on her shoulders before she could hit again, causing her to turn around and be pushed into the earth. As Doyle regained his balance and grasped the rope, her arms jerked behind her, causing pain to flare through her shoulders. Shadow mumbled, "Enough," his voice as steady as ever. Alexis's face remained expressionless as the ropes dug into her wrists again, more firmly and mercilessly. She exhaled heavily through her nose. Dominic shook his head and exhaled deeply. Time was wasted on it. Rust tore a piece of tape and put it over Alexis's mouth, making sure it was secure by pressing his fingers into her jaw. "You're not that tough anymore." She didn't respond, didn't provide them with the gratification of a fight. Dominic, already finished with this moment, turned to the others. "Come on." They hurried along, hardly even giving her a final look before getting back into the van. As the car peeled away, the tires threw up gravel and dirt, the doors slammed shut, and the engine revved. Alexis was left alone in the cold, beaten, bleeding, and bound as the van's sound receded into the night. They had just committed the greatest error of their lives, but she was still alive. There was silence in the night. The van's engine hummed in the distance, disappearing into the night. As the gravity of what had just transpired set in, Alexis lay motionless for a while, her body hurting and her breathing becoming calm. They had abandoned her in the middle of nowhere, gagged and chained. They believed they had triumphed. To them, she was practically dead. Testing the ropes around her wrists, she turned onto her side. The threads were pressing into her skin, stiffened after her last struggle for control. Breathing was a little more difficult, but not impossible, because of the duct tape covering her mouth. She concentrated, ignoring the discomfort, the fatigue, and the annoyance. None of that was important today. At the moment, freedom was the only thing that counted. Beneath her, the ground was uneven and hard, with sporadic leaves and patches of grass. The only sign that the world around her was still alive was the rustle of trees as the darkness grew farther and farther in all directions. No road, no indications of civilization, and no quick way to call for assistance were there. She remained calm. With her arms still stuck behind her, she rolled onto her knees after a minor twist. Although they were tight, the ropes weren't flawless. Doyle had tied them quickly, but speed was not the same as quality. Alexis felt the knots little give and the areas of tension by twisting her wrists. It was something, but not much. She inhaled deeply as she pressed the rope's edge up against a sharp rock buried in the ground. The fibers took a while to break. It would require patience and time. Every shift had to be planned and every movement had to be controlled. Rushing was not an option for her. The distant sound of something moving in the trees was carried by the somewhat stronger breeze. Perhaps an animal. Even worse, one of them returning to see if she was still alive. She accelerated. The strand started to unravel. Her muscles burned from standing still for too long, and sweat streamed down her temple. The rope caught against the rock at an exact angle as she spun once again. "Hurry!" The relief came immediately. She jerked her arms free as the tightness around her wrists decreased, wincing as blood surged back into her hands. She instantly reached up and removed the duct tape from her mouth, causing her skin to sting as it did so. Finally able to take a steady, deep breath, she let out a sigh. She was still not free. Alexis forced herself to stand up, flexing her fingers and moving her shoulders to relieve the stiffness. Her ribs hurt from the hits she had received earlier, and her body was covered in cuts and bruises. Now, however, none of that mattered. She spun around, looking around, admiring the scenery. There were enough trees in the area to give her some cover, but there was still enough for her to walk around. The vehicle tracks, which led back toward the main road, were still visible in the dirt. She knew better than to follow them. They would not pause their running. She had hunted men like them all her life. She was on a mission now. Alexis took a deep breath, her thoughts already formulating the next course of action. She had to get assistance and spread the information before they vanished once more. The manhunt would have already begun. The authorities would have begun monitoring their movements as soon as those barriers were put up. However, that was insufficient. She'd seen them firsthand. She was aware of their potential. Rust had been the most outspoken about wanting to get rid of her, but he wasn't alone. Grady had made the suggestion without thinking twice. And Dominic hadn't argued much, even though he was trying to seem cool. That provided her with all the information she required. They were running for more than freedom. In order to return to the only thing they knew, they were running. Alexis had been pursuing criminals for years, learning about their tendencies and errors. These were not merely fleeing men. They had a strategy. Somewhere they had contacts. A location for reassembling. Those who would make them vanish. They would disappear if she didn't stop them right away. Additionally, they wouldn't be considered fugitives when they returned. As monsters, they would be prepared to carry out their previous actions. That was never going to occur. Calming the fury within herself, she inhaled again. It wasn't fear. This was lucidity. She was not only going to live. They were all going to be hunted down by her. With her body hurting but her mind more acute than ever, Alexis moved with a deliberate urgency. The adrenaline was still numbing the worst of the bruises that would later appear, and the night air felt cold on her skin. The dense woodland had been oppressive. Now, however, she could make out the dim glow of headlights in the distance as she arrived at the clearing. A lighthouse amid the shadows. A road. Civilization. A way to change this. She was still in danger. She had to be careful not to make a mistake now. The inmates believed her dead. She was certain that they would complete the task at hand, even if they had second thoughts and went back to double-check. She needed to hurry. She pushed on, staying just within the tree line, scanning the vacant road ahead while staying in the shadows. The highway was a two-lane, calm one that hardly saw any traffic at this hour. Waiting for something better was not an option for her. She had to contact someone immediately if she wanted to stop them. Headlights crested over the far hill, and the quiet buzz of an engine broke the stillness. Without hesitation, she moved toward the road's edge, raising her arms and lowering them. Tires crunching on the gravel shoulder, the car paused, the driver obviously unsure as he absorbed her. Miles from anywhere, standing alone on a pitch-black road, bruised and battered. Carefully, the window rolled down to reveal a middle-aged man with a careful yet worried countenance. "Are you okay, miss?" Alexis wasted no time. "I need your phone," she said in a forceful yet composed tone. "Please. There is an urgent situation." After a brief moment of hesitation, the man fumbled in his pocket, took out his phone, and handed it to her. She snatched it swiftly, navigating the screen with her fingers as she dialed a number she was familiar with. It rang once, then again, and suddenly a sharp, anxious voice broke through the air. "Special Agent Carter is here." Alexis let out a breath and tightened her hold on the phone. "It's Commander Alexis Carter, Carter." Quiet. And then his tone changed. "Where in heck are you, Commander Carter? Every agency in the nation is searching for those fugitives." She steadied her breathing and added, "I know. And I am aware of their destination. A pause. Are you injured, then? Nothing that I can't manage, she said. Details were out of the question. Pay attention to me. They captured me. I am aware of their structure. I am aware of their movements. And Carter's voice tightened. I know they're not just running. Describe. According to Alexis, they had a plan before they ever started. This has nothing to do with vanishing. They have connections. Materials. They have no intention of fleeing. They want to get back together. Silence for a beat. Then Carter muttered a curse. You're where? Alexis spun around, looking around. Then noticed a weather-beaten, rusty road sign close to the shoulder. Just south of County Road 16. We will deploy a team. She clenched her jaw. Stay put. No, she responded, leaving no space for debate. You need me in this, Commander. They believe me dead. That's to our benefit. I can find them before they vanish forever. Carter let out a loud sigh, clearly hesitating. Are you sure you won't wait for backup? Alexis answered calmly, you already know the answer to that. A long pause, followed by a sigh. Okay, but don't enter by yourself. This is coordinated by us. She said, I'll check in when I have something. Before he could dispute any more, Alexis hung up the phone. She turned back to the driver, who was still observing her with a mix of surprise and worry. Did you require transportation somewhere? Or ought I to remain here? He asked thoughtfully. Alexis gave a headshake. No. You ought to leave. Tell the first police officer you encounter when you arrive in town, however, that Alexis Carter is still alive and is pursuing them. The man blinked, obviously not fully grasping the significance of her words. However, he nodded rapidly while his hands tightened their hold on the wheel. I can do that, all right. With a firm gesture of gratitude, she returned the phone and got out of the car. After another minute of hesitation, the motorist finally withdrew, his taillights fading into the darkness. Rolling her shoulders and letting out a breath, Alexis felt the dull ache seep into her bones. It made no difference that she was alone once more. The fugitives believed they had abandoned her. She would now ensure that none of them escaped. Alexis watched the car's taillights fade into the night as she stood at the edge of the road. For a brief period, the only sound breaking the stillness was the wind rustling through the trees and the murmur of far-off insects. Her muscles were stiff from the struggle and the lengthy walk through the woods, and her ribs were aching from the beatings she had received. Now, however, none of that mattered. She took a deep breath and concentrated. They believed they had triumphed, and the prisoners were out there. Their first error was that hubris. Reliving all she had learned throughout her time in their care, she turned back toward the woods and scanned the landscape. They were not merely jogging, they had a plan. Dominic's handling of the situation and Rust and Grady's casual conversation about getting rid of her gave her the impression that they were more than simply desperate guys seeking escape. They had nothing to lose, but more significantly, they had something to win, which made them dangerous. They had a destination, then. They wouldn't spend much time on major thoroughfares. Already, law officers would be patrolling the roadways, looking at every intersection, gas station, and stolen car. These were the kind of folks who didn't take chances. Before they vanished forever, Alexis needed to figure out their fallback plan and route. The van's tires shook up gravel, and she knelt close to the side of the road and ran her fingers over the soil. Back there, they had veered off the main highway and into the back roads. She was familiar with the area's general layout. They couldn't get too far before running across a town or another checkpoint. They would be moving in the direction of a location where they could completely disconnect from the grid if they were intelligent. About 30 miles to the north was an ancient truck stop, the type that served long-distance vehicles, cash transactions, and non-questioning people. That would be the place to go if they needed a new car. It would be an excellent place for them to meet someone if they were looking for one. She began to move, staying in the shadows and near the road's edge but away from the asphalt. She only needed to go a short distance in order to locate a ride, catch a break, and pass them before they could disappear. Her body pushed through the fatigue as the minutes turned into almost an hour, until she noticed the dim glow of headlights in the distance rising over the horizon. The silence of the night was broken by the rumbling engine of another vehicle, this time a truck. Alexis took a step forward and lowered it. The vehicle rolled to a stop next to her, its brakes screaming as it slowed. A guy in his 50s, the driver leaned out, his face etched with years of hard labor and lengthy hauls. He quickly scanned her, noting the bruises, the ripped clothes, and the unwavering resolve in her posture. "Miss, are you in trouble?" Although rough, his voice was not cruel. Alexis gave a nod. "The next truck stop is where I have to go." "You went in that direction?" After a brief moment of hesitation, the man jerked his thumb in the direction of the passenger seat. "Join in." As the truck roared ahead, she got in and settled into the seat. The smell that permeated everything in these long-haul rigs was that of diesel and old coffee in the cab. The driver gave her another quick look but didn't ask any questions. "Are you certain you don't require a hospital or anything?" "I'm grateful for the travel, but I'll be all right," Alexis remarked. He tapped the steering wheel and nodded. "You're fortunate that I was passing by. There aren't many people on this route after dark." Although she didn't think luck existed, she wasn't going to argue. For a while, they drove in quiet, the road ahead of them black, the only sounds outside being the distant chirp of nightbirds and the hum of tires. In order to focus, Alexis leaned back and briefly closed her eyes. She was drawing near. She was already planning her next move by the time she saw the truck halt. A few semi-trucks were parked along the lot, their drivers probably sleeping in their cabins, and the area was poorly illuminated. In the middle of the lot was a convenience shop with a flashing neon sign. A small group of drifters, truckers, and night shift workers lingered about the pumps. Then she noticed a black SUV parked far from the lights, close to the lot's edge. Intentionally, the license plate had a tiny layer of mud on it and the windows were darkened. They were present. The sharp tingle of expectation settled in her chest, but her pulse stayed steady. The driver glanced at her from the side as he turned into the lot. "Did you have to go here?" "Yes," Alexis answered, immediately grabbing the doorknob of the door. "I appreciate the lift." She quietly closed the door behind her and walked out, looking around the parking lot. The fluorescent lights created sharp shadows on the sidewalk, and the air smelled of cheap food and fuel. She had to approach and make sure it was them. They had no intention of staying long if they had stopped here. Before continuing, they were either exchanging cars, picking up someone, or assembling things. In order to blend in with the few individuals moving about the lot, Alexis moved slowly and casually. To get a better view, she bent her course toward the convenience shop first. She noticed activity inside the SUV as she passed it. In the front seats are two figures. Although she didn't instantly recognize them, she could tell everything she needed to know from their posture and the way they were seated, alert and observing the lot. Make a backup. Thus, the remaining ones were not far away. She continued to move, sneaking into the shop and moving behind a shelf close to the window. She could see the SUV clearly from here without anyone noticing. Speaking softly, one of the men inside raised his phone. A fire. Alexis's thoughts were quick. She still had time because if they were checking in with someone, it meant they weren't moving yet. She let out a deep exhale. Now she wasn't only getting closer. The moment has come for her to strike. Alexis remained low behind the convenience store shelf, breathing steadily. Through the wide glass window, her keen eyes focused on the black SUV. She had just enough cover to observe without drawing attention to herself because of the truck stop's dim interior lighting, which created lengthy shadows on the floor and shelves. Inside the SUV, two men were talking, their outlines changing as they made stiff, purposeful gestures. There was a problem. They were having a disagreement. From this distance, she couldn't hear them, but she didn't have to. Everything was conveyed by their body language. Anger that is scarcely controlled, impatience, and frustration. Leaner and with a deep scar along his cheek, one of them threw up his hands in despair before pushing the door open and leaving. The other, a stocky man with a shaved head, pounded his fist against the dashboard. Tensed, Alexis. Without turning around, the scarred guy muttered something under his breath as he closed the door behind him, straightened his jacket, and strode to the far end of the lot. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides as he walked purposefully. He was vulnerable because he had stepped away in the middle of a high-stakes escape, regardless of what they had been fighting about. She looked at the SUV again. The burly man was still inside, his head down slightly, his hands clutching the driving wheel as he leaned forward. Either he was calling or he was brooding. He wasn't moving yet, anyway. There was no sign of the other fugitives. This was her opportunity. Alexis moved swiftly but not hurriedly back toward the store's side exit. Without making a sound, she pushed the door open and stepped into the chilly night air, falling into stride behind the scarred guy right away while maintaining a reasonable distance and maintaining eye contact. He appeared to be unaware of her. His shoulders were slightly bent, his stance was rigid, and he moved quickly but erratically, as though his annoyance was overpowering his natural tendency to exercise caution. He swerved between the parked semis and continued on toward a line of discarded storage containers piled close to the lot's edge. As she followed, gliding between the shadows, her footsteps silent against the worn pavement, Alexis's pulse stayed steady. The area grew more remote the further he traveled. Only the faint glow of far-off city lighting and the sporadic flicker of passing headlights from the highway remained after the truck stop lights hardly made it this far. Behind them, the rustle of dry leaves in the wind and the quiet hum of crickets took the place of the bustling lot's sound. Alexis's body was ready to attack, and her fingers curled slightly. Then the man stopped abruptly. His body tensed, he cocked his head slightly to listen. Alexis's breathing became shallow as she froze. He twisted his shoulders as though he was arguing over something, but then he shook his head and continued to go while thrusting his hands into his pockets. She waited for him to go a few more paces before she began again, keeping her head slightly to the left and looking about for the best spot to go. He was moving in the direction of the storage containers, most likely to hide there while he considered his options. However, Alexis refused to give him that opportunity. She accelerated, reducing the distance between them. She hit him when he got to the first container's edge. Her arm sprang forward, encircling his throat in a firm, well-honed grip. She simultaneously twisted, pulling his leg out from under him and pushing him back with her momentum. He responded immediately. His hands snapped up to try to snag her hold as he swore, but she was already shifting her weight, knocking him off balance. She remained on top of him as she tightened her grip, pinning him despite their violent impact on the ground. He thrashed in an attempt to distract her, but his movements were too erratic and distracted now. Alexis maintained a firm hold, applying just enough pressure to keep him breathing heavily and keeping him awake but unable to resist. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," she said in a quiet, controlled voice. The man fought to buck her off, his body jerking, but his power was rapidly diminishing. She relaxed just enough to allow him to take a wheezed breath. "Where are the others heading?" Her tone remained steady as she inquired. She sensed the hesitancy beginning to creep in as the man coughed, his body still stiff. He wasn't in charge. The planner wasn't him. Like the others, he was doing as he was told. Alexis moved her hand so that her knee was on his chest. "You've been caught already," she said. "You're much more foolish than you appear to be if you believe Dominic will return for you. Maybe you won't return to prison with shattered ribs if you give me what I need to know." The man's fingers twitched against the pavement as he grunted in pain. He was considering his alternatives and attempting to determine whether he had a viable escape route. She could see the instant he decided. With a short sigh and a little inclination of his head, he mumbled, "They're going south." Alexis's eyes narrowed. "Where?" "Keep safe." Dominic wheezed, "Some guy I know from back there." The plan was for them to meet up there, vanish, and acquire new IDs and everything. Alexis's thoughts were quick. She was already running out of time if they had a contact set up. Before they could completely vanish into whatever network was waiting for them, she had to move. She tightened her hold one final time, pulling down until his breath caught. "Name me." The man shook his head and coughed. "I don't." She applied more pressure. "Collins." His voice was tight as he coughed out. "A man by the name of Collins. All I know is that." For an additional moment, Alexis kept him there, learning every nuance of his face, his breathing, and the way his heart pounded under her hold. She slapped her elbow into the side of his skull and knocked him unconscious without saying another word. She let out a breath, got to her feet, and shook her fingers while gazing down at his unconscious body. 7 to go, 1 down. Her thoughts were already one step ahead as she turned back toward the truck stop. Now she had a name, a lead, a direction. The search was no longer merely drawing near. It was underway. With a deep breath, Alexis knelt next to the motionless man and hurriedly looked through his pockets. A switchblade, a cheap burner phone, and a folded map with some places marked. She left the knife in her pocket but pocketed the map and the phone. It wasn't necessary for her. She glanced back at the truck stop lot, looking for any signs of movement. The driver of the black SUV was still anxious and squirming in his seat as it sat close to the edge. She could tell he was getting nervous by the way he kept gazing toward the convenience shop even though he hadn't yet turned the engine over. She needed to hurry. She opened the burner phone and looked through the call history. Most of the recent outgoing calls were to numbers she didn't recognize, but one in particular caught her attention. C. Collins. Their interaction. After mentally noting the number, she dialed a secure line. Almost instantly, the call connected. "You have something, tell me." Carter's tone was urgent and piercing. "I have more than that," Alexis murmured quietly as she drew farther into the darkness and away from the unconscious man. "They're down, one of them. He's growing skeptical, but there's still another in the lot. On him, I discovered a burner phone. A number with the letter C on it. It's probably their contact." Carter muttered curses to himself. "Collins? My guess is that. They're going to meet him in the south. We may be able to locate him before they do if we can obtain a trace on this phone." Carter said, "I'll get our tech team on it." "The one you took down is where?" "The storage bins at the rear of the property are out cold. We'll need someone to come get him before he wakes up, but he's not leaving." "Now send local units," Carter said. "But hear me out, Alexis. Don't talk to the second person by himself. People are shifting into their positions. Await the backup." Alexis didn't take her eyes from the SUV. The man inside was shifting, his fingers hammering against the steering wheel, his stance tight. He was aware of a problem. "That's not possible," she stated. "We will lose them once more if he departs. The others will vanish when he warns them." Carter blew out a long breath. "This bothers me," she said. "You don't have to. Simply be prepared." The line paused for a moment. Then, with more poise, Carter spoke once more. "Okay, I have teams on their way to where you are. Give me a starting point." Alexis glanced at the location settings on the phone. She discovered what she needed, even if it was an outdated model. The most recent ping from the phone was close to Mason Ridge. They appeared to have been checking in frequently. That might be where they meet. "You're over 40 miles south of that," Carter mumbled. "That aligns with the pieces we've been assembling." They will attempt to go there by morning if it is their safe haven. Alexis gripped the phone more tightly. Then we're short on time. Carter's voice became stern. Listen, Alexis. Do it clean if you defeat this man. We need him to speak. I get it. Before he could utter another word, she hung up. Before sliding back toward the truck stop lot, she pocketed the burner phone and gave the unconscious fugitive one more look. The driver of the SUV was still there, still moving around in his seat. Now, however, he was holding on to the steering wheel more tightly while looking back at the store. He was going to do something. With her muscles tensed and her mind focused, Alexis took a steady breath. The police were getting closer. The official manhunt had begun. But before he could alert the others, she needed to stop this one. Alexis remained in the darkness, her gaze fixed on the black SUV, her breathing calm. The man inside had moved once again, his fingers pounding wildly on the steering wheel as his eyes darted from the dimly lighted parking lot to the convenience store entrance. He sensed that something was wrong. She watched as he swiftly dialed on his phone. If he was phoning one of the others, they would realize something was off as soon as he received a response. She could not allow that to occur. She emerged from the cover without hesitation and strode with deliberate purpose toward the SUV. When the driver saw her in the corner of his eye, his head swung toward her and his eyes narrowed. Confusion briefly appeared on his face. She wasn't meant to be present. Her death was expected. Then it dawned on me. Just as his hand flew to the gearshift and he dropped the phone, Alexis noticed the panic in his eyes. She made a lunge. She grabbed his jacket with her other hand and wrenched the door handle, tearing it open before he could put the SUV in gear. He twisted away, letting out a choked curse. She was quicker, though. Before he could kick out of the car, his boot caught her in the thigh and she pulled him halfway out. It was sufficient to break her hold, but not enough to knock her back. He broke loose and ran away. Alexis made no hesitation. Her muscles burned with fatigue as she ran after him, but her mental razor remained focused. Although he was swift, his motivation was terror rather than strategy. He tried to lose her in the little spaces between parked semi-trucks, his boots slamming on the pavement. She was becoming bigger. His breathing was labored as he glanced over his shoulder. His error. Alexis pushed harder, bringing them closer. She swiveled, waiting for him to do something before he did. The earth dipped into a drainage ditch at the lot's edge, and he turned left. She surged once again, catching him in the middle of his stride. They rolled over the uneven gravel as they struck the ground hard. She easily rejected his attempt to twist out from under her and fling a wild elbow into her ribs, shifting her weight and pinning him down with her momentum. His body was still flailing beneath her, and his breathing was irregular, but he was rapidly running out of energy. Alexis took hold of his wrist and gave it a violent twist behind his back, causing him to grunt in pain. "Are you finished?" she inquired. Despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins, she lowered her voice. "Leave me alone." Still struggling, he spat. Alexis tightened her hold, pressing her knee into his back. "You run once more. I make sure you stay in this place." He lost the will to fight. He lacked training. This was not what he was made for. He was just another aggressive coward who had been hiding behind stronger people for far too long. Alexis moved, taking the burner phone she had stolen from the first suspect out of her pocket. She opened it and punched the dial. On the first ring, Carter replied. "You have him, tell me." Alexis looked down at the man who was breathing in short, dejected gasps underneath her. "Yes," she said. Another item crossed off the list. Carter blew out a long breath. "Excellent. 5 minutes out are local units. Are you holding him?" For emphasis, she tightened her hold on his wrist and said, "He's not going anywhere." The fugitive grunted in pain, but it was muffled. Then, Carter urged, "Sit tight." Although Carter couldn't see it, Alexis nodded, "We're locking this down now." She warned that the others would soon realize something was amiss. "We must act immediately if we hope to capture them before they vanish." "We will," Carter promised. Alexis hung up the phone one by one, letting out a deep breath as she looked down at the man crushed beneath her. He was no longer having difficulty. He was paying attention. Excellent. She had not finished yet. The hunt went on. Alexis remained motionless as she awaited the sirens to come, her knees continuing to pin the fugitive to his back. Minutes before, he had ceased to struggle, breathing in ragged gasps as he became aware that he had nowhere to go. Worse than being stranded, he was by himself. Whether they intended to or not, the others had abandoned him. That was the initial rift in his self-assurance. Alexis's voice was low but purposeful as she replied, "You're lucky I got to you first. If you had survived, the others wouldn't have waited to see. You would have been left bleeding on the street by them." His face partially buried in the gravel, he did not answer. His fingers moved on the pavement, yet his jaw clenched firm. A subtle hint. He was paying attention. She leaned in a little after allowing the silence to last for a few seconds. "Do you believe Vinny will be waiting for you?" she whispered. "Do you think that now that he is aware of our impending arrival, he will risk returning for you?" "Nothing has changed." Alexis let out a slow breath. "I am already aware of Collins. You were meeting him, I know that. I am aware that there was more to this than just running, and I am also aware that you are running out of time." She loosened her hold a little. Just enough to show that she wasn't going to abandon him in the dirt forever, but not enough to allow him up. "But a name isn't enough for me. If you let me know where they're heading next, I might make sure you don't bear all responsibility for the outcome." It made the fugitive's breath catch a little. He wasn't like the others, but he was attempting to maintain some control. The mastermind wasn't him. The muscle wasn't him. He was a subordinate. And he had no one to follow for the first time. The sirens were approaching. "There's not much time for you to make a decision," Alexis added. "You're merely a number once the police take you in. No bargains. No power. Just another criminal apprehended. You still have an option, though." He had a working jaw. He breathed shallowly. He continued to debate and try to determine whether he could use his words to get out of this situation. He was denied the opportunity by Alexis. "Do you really believe that the others aren't already betraying one another?" she went on. "They are aware of our approach. They are aware that we won't quit. What you can give me now is all that's left of you." One more pause. Finally, his fingers began to twitch once more. His voice raspy from the hunt, he murmured, "They're not staying with Collins." It was only the initial stop. Alexis's eyes narrowed. "Proceed. They are separating." He spoke quickly, as though he had suddenly realized it was no longer worth clinging to. "Rust and Vinny are driving west in a car. Shadow and Grady are going out with someone else. Someone from outside the city." It was intended that the others would remain silent until the situation subsided. Alexis held on to his wrist tightly. "Where?" The runaway paused. "But just for a second. A cabin. Close to the state boundary. Before we left, Vinny had it ready." Alexis's mind was already at work as she filed the information away. They had a complete support system if they had scheduled several stops in advance. Those who are prepared to take chances in order to remain anonymous. This implied that they were no longer only coping with fugitives. They had an operation going on. When a police car skidded to a stop close by, its doors flinging open, the first set of red and blue lights blazed against the pavement. As the officers drew their rifles, Alexis straightened and pulled the fugitive up with her, holding on to his wrist tightly. She moved aside and let the fugitive take charge, waving toward them as she stated, "Got one for you. He has a lot to tell." While the other officer continued to concentrate on Alexis, one of the officers went in right away and placed the suspect in handcuffs. "Are you okay, ma'am?" She nodded curtly. "I need a secure line now, but I'm all right." The cop nodded and reached for his radio, saying, "We don't have much time before the others move again." As the fugitive was dragged toward the cruiser that was waiting, Alexis inhaled deeply and moved back. His confidence was destroyed, and his face was pallid. She would be there when the net finally snapped shut, and it was closing. As they put the fugitive inside the police cruiser, Alexis remained just outside, his shoulders drooping in silent defeat, his head cocked downward. His panic was over. At this point, reality was taking over. He couldn't take back what he had spoken. The moment he realized he was alone, any devotion he could have felt to the others had vanished. However, Alexis had lost interest in him. Her thoughts were already focused on the people who were still free. After taking the burner phone out of her pocket, she opened it and went through the call log once more. Collins. The secret was that she could cut off their sole dependable source of support before the fugitives even got to him if she could determine his precise position. She had received helpful information from the man in the cruiser, but certain pieces were still missing. With the radio in hand, the cop she had previously spoken to came closer. He held it out to her and said, "Your contact's on the line." Alexis accepted it without question. "Carter." His voice was heard right away. Focused but tense. "Tell me you have something." She announced that they were divorcing. Rust and Vinny are going west. Shadow and Grady are going out of town to meet someone. Right now, I need eyes on the roadways. Carter reassured her that we were already on the move. State troopers are erecting checkpoints. All of the main exits have been marked, and a federal task force is keeping an eye on the roads. They're not making much progress. According to Alexis, they will not use the highways. Secondary routes will be taken by them. Don't be noticed. We must stay ahead of them and not chase after them if we want to capture them. Carter gave a quick exhale. Remote locations are already being scanned by aircraft surveillance, but there is still a lot of ground to cover. We should start reducing it as soon as possible. Alexis's fingers gripped the burner phone more tightly. "I may be able to accomplish it." A pause. Then Carter's tone became stern. "Speak to me." She turned to look at the police cruiser behind her. Inside, the fugitive was looking straight ahead, his mind racing, his teeth clenched. She sensed that he had already surrendered information. And there was more. "I need to spend 5 minutes with him alone," she remarked. Carter let out a sigh. "We have protocols, Alexis." She interrupted, "We don't have time for procedures. He is not as ignorant as he claims to be. He's afraid. If I push him in the correct direction, he'll talk." One more pause. Then reluctantly, "Make it fast." After returning the radio to the officer, Alexis moved in the direction of the cruiser. As she opened the door and climbed onto the seat next to him, the fugitive hardly moved. His eyes were fixed on the dashboard, not on her. His hands were twitching against his lap, yet his breathing was slow. "You haven't finished yet," she remarked calmly. He let out a breath via his nostrils. "I shared my knowledge with you. You told me what you believed would help you leave this situation more quickly." Alexis made a correction, "But you omitted something crucial. Quiet." She lowered her voice and leaned slightly in. Collins was their first stop since Vinny had enough faith in him. This indicates that they required more than just a safe haven. What was it? Once more, his fingers twitched. "A clue." Alexis went on, "You can either answer me right now or I'll let Carter deal with you the way he deals with time wasters." After a little pause, she said, "And trust me, you won't like that." The runaway's body went rigid as he swallowed hard. Then he broke at last. He whispered, "New documents. Collins knows someone who can get them beyond state lines and obtain them IDs." They were dispersing because it was simpler to vanish in smaller groups. Although Alexis's pulse stayed constant, she was aware that this was significant. This was more than a safe home if Collins was managing fresh identities. It was a whole network set up to hide fugitives. Collins was therefore more than just a contact. He participated in this game as a player. She persisted. "He's where?" The runaway paused. Then he muttered, obviously reluctantly. "Farmhouse. Close to Millhaven." They were initially meeting him there. Alexis learned the name by heart. With long roads that led nowhere, Millhaven was an old rural town that was primarily farmland and was therefore easy to hide in. They must have been planning this long before the escape if they had built up an operation there. After giving a nod, she grabbed the door handle. As she walked out, she remarked, "You did one smart thing tonight." She quickly grabbed for the radio and closed the door behind her, trying not to destroy it. "Carter," she uttered sharply. "I've got a place. Millhaven." They're going to a farmhouse." There was a brief silence. Then, "We will now proceed with it. You're not moving. You already know the answer." "Alexis." Carter let out a sigh. "You're not possible." She grinned a little. "You're welcome." She turned to face the closest police car after tossing the radio back to the officer. The net was getting tighter. It was the last stage of the hunt. Collins believed he was going to release these men. He was going to discover how mistaken he was. As the police car raced along the back roads toward Millhaven, Alexis was in the front seat. Gravel being kicked up by the tires. As the units moved into position, the radio crackled with updates. It was not far to the farmhouse now. If the roads held, it would take less than 20 minutes. Her fingers lightly tapped her thigh as she gazed forward, her thoughts well ahead of their destination. The farmhouse served as more than just a place to hide. It was a center. Collins was establishing new identities, new documents, and a means for the fugitives to escape before the net completely closed in on them. However, the net was now closing more quickly than they had anticipated. Once more, Carter's voice could be heard over the radio. "We have verified that there are 2 fugitives on the property, all units. Until we have a visual on Collins, we are holding our position." Alexis let out a slow breath. It was the correct thing to do. Collins may go if they barged in too soon. Additionally, the entire network might disperse before they could be brought down if he managed to escape. This was about stopping the entire enterprise, not just apprehending 2 fugitives. She reached for the radio. "What is the number of exits in the farmhouse?" Another voice responded. A leader of the tactical team. "There are 2 main exits, the front and the back. Additionally, the property has a barn that is probably connected by an underground tunnel. They will go there if they attempt to flee." Alexis's fingers became a little tighter. "Then, before we do action, we must block that." The officer verified, "We have a team moving into position near the barn now." The road curved, and the farmhouse's silhouette could be seen in the distance when their car's headlights pierced the darkness. The building was set back from the road, encircled by dense tree patches and partially obscured by high fields. It was accessed by a dirt driveway, and Alexis could make out the form of an old truck parked close to the barn in the little moonlight. "That's their car," she whispered. Once more, Carter's voice could be heard. "Maintain positions. Before we move, we must make sure Collins is present." Alexis remained silent. "This has to be clean for them." She looked around the property and saw someone moving close to the front porch. A man with a calm yet cautious stance was venturing outdoors and starting a cigarette. She knew him right away. One of the 2 men inside was Rust. A second shadow, bigger and slower, passed close to the barn. Two of the group's most dangerous men were Shadow. Alexis's body stiffened a little. Collins must have been anticipating high-risk customers if they were the ones that arrived here. This implied that the activity at the farmhouse was more than simple forgery. Once more, the radio crackled. "We have proof. Inside is Collins." Alexis took a slow breath. "Then we're on our way." The reaction was instantaneous. "Proceed. Proceed. Proceed." Engines roared as many cars tore up the gravel road toward the home, and flashing lights pierced the darkness as tactical teams charged forward. Shouts broke out before Rust had a chance to respond. "Raise your hands. Get down on the ground." Alexis had already thrown open the police car's door and slammed into the ground. Rust grabbed for his waistband, but he froze when a red laser sight sliced across his chest before he could draw a firearm. One of the cops yelled, "Don't be dumb." After a brief moment of hesitation, he slowly lifted his hands. Alexis continued. Shadow was already on his way, running for the barn, his huge body tearing through the night. He had the tunnel in his sights. Alexis yelled, "Stop him," and pushed harder, her legs burning as she got closer. Shadow didn't slow down. His big boots kicked up gravel and dirt as he neared the barn. It would be a headache to trace him down if he managed to get underground. Before she could fire, another shot rang out through the darkness as Alexis reached for her sidearm. One round, exact. Non-lethal. Shadow lost pace before he could reach the barn door, his leg giving way beneath him as he staggered. He was just trying to get back up when Alexis lunged and slammed into him. Both of them crashed to the ground as a result of the impact, with dust flying everywhere. With a shout, Shadow twisted beneath her, attempting to shake her away. However, Alexis's hold was already firm. She pushed his arm back at an angle that caused his shoulder to ache sharply as she utilized his weight against him. "You're done," she remarked in a cool, collected tone. Shadow gave a hoarse snarl, but he stopped fighting her. When backup arrived, it was indicated by the weight of approaching footsteps. Shadow was seized by two officers who secured cuffs around his wrists and pulled him the remainder of the way down. Alexis rolled her shoulders and let out a breath. Law enforcement already surrounded the farmhouse. Rust lay shackled on the ground, his face a mixture of resignation and annoyance. Officers were hauling Collins from inside, his face whitened as he recognized how completely everything had collapsed. The Millhaven operation was over. As Carter stepped out with his arms crossed, Alexis turned to face his approaching SUV. "You simply can't resist, can you?" She grinned. "You adore it." Carter sent out a sigh but remained silent. "Collins is being held. We can then begin examining his network. He has been working with more than this team if he has been offering resources, safe places, and phony identification. We may be underestimating this." Alexis gave a nod. "Next, we excavate." Carter paused to observe her. "It's time for you to relax. Let's think about this." She gave a headshake. "Not until the others are imprisoned." Carter let out another sigh. "I thought you would say that." He rubbed his jaw and headed toward the farmhouse. "We have two more down. There are still 4 people running." Alexis narrowed her gaze a little. "Not for very long." While officers guarded the situation, Alexis watched from the edge of the farmhouse porch. The raid had been successful. A table full of evidence awaiting analysis, 2 fugitives apprehended, and their primary contact handcuffed. It wasn't over, though. Now that Collins had been seized, the 4 remaining would be in a precarious situation. Men who were desperate were careless, and careless men made blunders. When they did, she was going to be there. As the remaining officers loaded Collins onto a cruiser, Carter approached her side, his face unreadable. He answered, "We've already begun processing him." Not yet speaking. However, he will. Alexei S. was certain of that. Collins was not a man suited to this kind of stress. In order to avoid being captured himself, he had dedicated his life to assisting criminals in escaping. Now his entire network was about to fall apart. And she was aware that he would stop at nothing to save himself, if she knew anything about guys like him. Her eyes darted to the barn, where investigators were still searching for evidence, as she left the porch. When he breaks, I want to be in the room. Carter didn't protest, but he gave her a knowing glance. First, let the feds process him. This is what we do by the book. Alexis remained silent. No necessity existed. They both understood she wasn't going to wait for reality to overtake bureaucracy. Every second they squandered allowed the others to get farther away since time was running out. Agents were rummaging through documents, laptops, and burner phones on a table covered in papers inside the farmhouse. She glanced at some of them, observing the degree of specificity. There had been more to Collins than a contact. They didn't realize how long he had been planning this. Travel routes, money transfers, and counterfeit passports. There was more to this than only concealing 8 men. This whole network was set up to make people permanently vanish. She flipped through a list of names and numbers and mumbled, he wasn't just helping them. He was in charge of an operation. Carter rubbed his jaw and sighed, indicating that we had just interrupted multiple clients. Alexis's mouth clenched. Collins isn't only afraid of us, if that's the case. He fears that someone else will come looking for him. Leverage was that. An hour later, in a darkened interrogation room with tense air, Alexis sat opposite Collins. His formerly cautious poise was crumbling at the edges as his hands were tied to the metal table. Playing the part of the man with alternatives, he had been silent thus far. Alexis, however, was wiser. From next to her, Carter remarked, "You already know how this goes. You remain silent. We bury you. You comply. Perhaps you leave this with an agreement." With a deep exhale, Collins gazed at a place on the table. "I have no knowledge." Alexis gave a little bend to her head. "Given that we recently raided your enterprise and discovered enough evidence to lock you up for the next 20 years, that's fascinating." He tightened his jaw. Now that his kingdom had been burned to the ground, he was beginning to feel the weight of what was happening. She leaned a little forward. "You weren't merely a place to stop. They relied on you to get them to the finish line because you were the backup plan. And it's gone now. Collins, tell me where they're going now." Although he paused, Alexis could already see the solution developing in his mind. The calculations were changing and the wheels were whirling. He was attempting to determine whether there was still a move available to him and whether he could outplay this. "Do you really believe they won't blame you?" She went on. "Vinny isn't the kind to stick with someone. He won't hesitate to cut you loose if he believes it would buy him more time. Unless he's already done so." Collins' fingers made a slight but visible movement against the table. Alexis applied a little more pressure. "You don't have to accompany them on their descent. You provide for our needs. You survive this ordeal." There was a long pause. Collins eventually exhaled slowly after that. "When they approached the border, they were to give me a call. I don't know if they still will," he murmured, "but that was the plan." Carter motioned for one of the agents to leave the room right away. "Obtain a history of every recent communication. I wanted Liv if Vinny or anyone else calls." Alexis continued to stare at Collins. "In what location would they cross?" He gave a quick breath. "Near the western state line is an old smuggling route. The main roads don't lead to it. Keep quiet. Police rarely inspect it." Alexis immediately committed the place to memory. It was logical. They could leave the country before dawn if they had a contact who could help them get there. With a deliberate motion, she slid her chair back and stood. So that's our next destination. Far from Millhaven, in the woods close to the border, Vinny walked next to a stolen vehicle, his face tense with annoyance. With his eyes inscrutable and piercing, Grady perched on a nearby rock and flipped a knife between his fingers. "Are you certain Collins is still doing well?" Vinny's mouth tightened. He had better be. There aren't many choices left. Rust and Shadow had vanished. There was compromise at the farmhouse. Vinny was getting restless because Collins hadn't returned his calls in a while. Grady grinned a little. Plans could always change. Take a different route. While we're doing it, perhaps get rid of the others. Even though Vinny gave him a stern look, he didn't protest. Time was not on their side. They just were unaware of Alexis's growing intimacy. With the thick woods on each side creating deep shadows under the moon's dim light, the gravel road was lengthy and deserted. As the tactical teams completed arranging themselves, Alexis stood close to the hood of a blacked-out SUV, her arms folded, her gaze looking forward at the road. Collins had given up a smuggling route that was hardly more than a forgotten track, an old bootlegger's pass from decades ago that was being utilized to get people and goods across the border covertly. This was the last way out before the fugitives really vanished, if their original plan was executed. As he listened to the final radio updates, Carter stood next to her, his face somber. Teams are set up at both ends of the pass. Although there is air support available, this location is crowded. We might lose them if they enter the forest. Alexis adjusted the earpiece connected to the other units and said, "They won't get into the trees. Before they can respond, we strike them quickly and forcefully." Carter rubbed his jaw and breathed. "Do you really think they'll make it through here?" Collins relinquished them too readily. "They may reroute if they think something is amiss." Alexis gave a headshake. "Dominic has no choice. He doesn't trust anyone but Collins, and he doesn't have time to think of another escape path. He will still pass through this place. The only thing to wonder is if they anticipate trouble." Her eyes grew piercing as she looked toward the tree line. Carter didn't dispute, "And I dislike placing bets against folks who have nothing to lose." Through Alexis's earpiece, there was a crackle. "We're moving. A car is coming from the north. No headlights." Although Alexis could sense the change in the air, her pulse stayed constant. It was this. The radio went on. The voice was controlled and clipped. "One car. Inside, there are 4 heat signatures. Going slowly." Pulling the suppressed sidearm from her holster, Alexis moved away from the SUV and headed toward the road's edge. The tactical units were still camouflaged around her, dispersed in locations that prevented escape. The trap would spring as soon as the fugitives arrived at the predetermined spot. At first, the sound of the approaching car was hardly audible above the night air. Then, at the far end of the pass, the black silhouette of the stolen automobile appeared, sliding forward painfully slowly. No headlights. No abrupt motions. They exercised caution. Untrustworthy. It was Dominic who drove. In the driver's seat, Alexis could just make out his silhouette, his head moving slightly, like though he was looking for something strange. Even from this distance, she could sense the tightness in Grady's shoulders, despite his more relaxed posture in the passenger seat. They were uncomfortable. They sensed that something was looming above them. Alexis said into her communications, "Hold." The car was nearly at the spot. Another 10 feet. 5. Then Dominic abruptly applied the brakes. Everything, for a moment, froze. Then there was an uproar. As automobiles rushed onto the road, blocking off the front and back exits, the tactical squad moved in, floodlights flashing on. The night was filled with shouts. "Raise your hands. Get out of the car." The fugitives, however, made no hesitation. Grady was the first to move, pulling a shotgun from the car's floor that had been sawed off and firing a blind shot through the windshield. Some of the agents had to duck back for shelter as the bomb broke the glass. Meanwhile, Dominic pushed the car into reverse and attempted to spin it around, the tires squealing on the gravel. Alexis didn't hold back. As the passenger door swung open and Grady jumped out with his rifle still in hand, she charged forward. Before he could get to his feet and run toward the tree line, he twisted mid-roll and fired another uncontrolled shot. She had already caught him. Alexis sped across the gravel, her footsteps quiet as she cut the angle. Despite his size, Grady lacked training. He sprinted like a guy accustomed to pursuit. Not being pursued. Not even her approach was audible to him. As he got to the edge of the trees, she lunged and tackled him. His rifle skidded over the soil as they struck the ground hard. She locked his wrist and caught his arm in a terrible angle as he turned, hurling a wild elbow into her ribcage. She responded, calmly yet sharply, "Don't." Grady let out a grunt and struggled for a second more before she twisted even more, choking out a curse. He became motionless. The road behind her was still in disarray. Dominic had left the car behind and was running across the pass. Alongside him, another fugitive, likely one of the more reserved Morgans, was moving, blending into the darkness with the strewn-about cover of the landscape. Alexis's hand grew tighter. This wasn't over, even if Grady was down. She faced her communications. "Two of us are on foot, cutting through the pass and heading southwest." Carter answered in a piercing tone. "We will intercept. Have you got Grady?" The man imprisoned beneath her, his face contorted in agony, caught Alexis's attention. "Yes," she said. Another item crossed off the list. Carter wasted no time. "Then, move. Tonight is the last day of this." With a sigh, Alexis pushed Grady onto his stomach and then snatched a pair of handcuffs off his wrists. The fight was gone, yet he was struggling. He was aware that it was over. She had stopped even glancing at him. She had already fixed her gaze on the woods. She was going to find Dominic and his remaining guys, who were still on the run. Despite the heat on her legs, Alexis managed to control her breathing as she ran through the thick foliage. Still ahead, Dominic and Morgan crashed like cornered animals through the undergrowth. They had lost their sense of purpose. Their instinct was instinctive survival. However, Alexis wasn't merely pursuing them. She was completing this. Because they believed she wasn't worth killing, they had taken days from her, beaten her, restrained her, and left her to perish in the woods. From the beginning, they had underestimated her. At this point, they had run out of time, allies, and choices. In her ear, her serenity cracked. "They're moving in the direction of the riverbank. Are you able to see?" Alexis didn't answer the phone. The team did not benefit from this. It was a personal matter. Her muscles screamed as she pushed harder, and she swiftly closed the gap. Morgan was shoved toward the tree line by Dominic, who barked something at him ahead. Morgan, however, paused. He was aware. They knew they wouldn't survive this. Knew there wouldn't be another way out if Alexis caught them. Subsequently, Dominic turned to face her, his expression contorted with weariness, frustration, and terror. "Keep going," he yelled at Morgan before turning around and confronting her, his fists clenched. He had decided to stop running. He desired a brawl. Alexis continued to move quickly. He was driven backward against a huge tree trunk by her forceful blow, which sent her shoulder slamming into his chest. The contact knocked the breath out of his lungs with a heavy, hollow thump. Dominic wasn't weak, though. In a violent tangle of limbs and raw muscle, he quickly recovered, grabbed the front of her jacket, and swung wildly, sending them both to the ground. Morgan paused close by, unsure whether to assist or run. Dominic pushed his knee into Alexis's ribs, sending her sideways as she spun quickly and landed on top of him. He rolled beside her, holding her down for a brief moment until she yanked herself free and gave him a hard headbutt that left him stunned long enough for her to switch places. She made no hesitation. She slammed a fist into his face after driving her elbow into his throat, briefly stopping his breathing. Once. Twice. 3 times. She hardly noticed the agony in her knuckles. "That's all you have?" Dominic twisted violently, his fist hammering into her side as he wheezed, blood streaming from his mouth. Despite feeling the impact, she continued. With ruthless accuracy, she took hold of his wrist, twisted it at an odd angle, and pushed him onto his stomach. He tried to buck her off by flailing beneath her, but she had him now. She growled and slammed her knee into his back, forcing a choked grunt from his throat. "This is for when you left me in the woods," she continued. "This is for all the women you have harmed and all the people you believed you could get away with destroying." She struck him in the face with her hand. Once more. And once more. And once more. When Morgan finally recovered from his horror, he hurried forward, but Alexis anticipated him. At the last second, she rolled off Dominic, ducked under Morgan's punch, and then slammed an uppercut into his stomach. He stumbled back, unable to breathe, but she prevented him from getting better. Before delivering a vicious knee to his jaw that knocked him flat, she kicked his knee in, sending him crashing down onto one leg. He moaned and attempted to move over, but Alexis pinned him down by stepping on his wrist. As he struggled to stand, Dominic choked and spat blood into the ground. Alexis shook her fists and shouted, "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Even though his teeth were stained with blood, Dominic smiled and said, "Now you're going to wish I had killed you instead. Aren't I still breathing?" He was pulled upright by Alexis's collar, which allowed him to slam his head on the tree behind him. His body instantly turned slack and sagged to the floor. She kicked Morgan onto his back as he attempted to crawl away, then squatted down and grabbed him by the front of his shirt. "You're done," she stated in a steely voice. Morgan's eyes were blurry and his breathing was labored. You won't kill us," Alexis said, releasing his shirt and allowing him to fall to the ground. "No," she said, "but I'll make sure you remember this night forever." The team's arrival was indicated by the distant boom of motors. It was finished now, but she had taken her time. Morgan and Dominic were done. Slowly, Alexis stood, beaten and bruised but unbroken. She looked down at the 2 men, their faces distended with the weight of her vengeance, their bodies ruined, moaning in the mud. There was nothing more for her to say. She was already victorious. Where Dominic and Morgan had fallen, the ground was still disturbed, and the ground beneath them was darkened by blood. The battle had been vicious and intimate. Alexis's dying moments were the culmination of everything she had gone through. She was standing over them, breathing steadily despite the aching in her ribs, her knuckles stinging. She had prevailed. As police enforcement closed in, the sound of approaching cars filled the quiet, and dazzling beams of light pierced the trees. Despite the fact that the battle was already done, tactical squads swiftly dispersed, guns high, and scanned the perimeter. Carter was the first to go, looking around before focusing on Alexis. His gaze shifted from the broken man at her feet to her bruised knuckles. "I assume that they fight?" Alexis let out a breath and shook her hands. "Not that much of one." With a sigh, Carter wiped his face and motioned for the squad to enter. Officers rushed in, cuffed Dominic and Morgan, and despite their drowsy complaints, pulled them to their feet. With his face bloated and blood still trickling from his nose, Dominic's head lolled a little. But when Alexis looked him in the eyes, he contrived a smirk. His voice was hardly coherent as he rasped, "I hope it was worth it. Carter, we'll see you later." Alexis remained unblinking. She moved forward gradually until she was within earshot of him alone. "No," she answered in a chilly tone. "No, you won't." Dominic's smile wavered, only momentarily. What little retaliation he still had was cut off as an officer pushed him in the direction of the transport truck. As they pulled him away, Morgan hardly said anything. He was pushed into the rear of another cruiser, his hands trembling a little, his face pallid. Unlike Dominic, he had no illusions of ever being free again after witnessing what Alexis was capable of. He saw the last of them vanish into the line of police cars, and Carter exhaled. His voice carried more weight than the words when he said, "It's done. All 8 have been identified. No loose ends." Alexis looked toward the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were starting to illuminate the sky. Knowing that this was finally finished after everything felt odd, Carter moved next to her. "We will ensure that they never again see the exterior of a prison. They will be buried by the allegations alone. Conspiracy, attempted murder, and kidnapping. They will be used as an example by the federal government." Alexis gave a nod. "Excellent." Carter took a moment to examine her. "He advised you to get checked out. You look terrible." Alexis exhaled softly, almost if she was laughing. "It seems about right." She was aware that she should be worn out and that all that had transpired should be bearing down on her. Instead, she simply felt clear and stable. She was in charge once more for the first time since this nightmare started. Carter gave a headshake. "You're impossible," Alexis said, turning to finally look him in the eye. He didn't disagree, but he sighed, "And you wouldn't have it any other way." The fugitives were taken to a location where they would never be free again as the last ship withdrew. The men who had attempted to utilize the woodland as a means of escape had left it silent. The chilly air filled Alexis's lungs as she took a leisurely breath. It was finished. With each step, she left the past behind as she turned away from the deserted road and began to walk. The precinct was quiet hours later. The quiet that only occurs when a major issue has finally been resolved. The radio buzz had subsided to normal updates, the manhunt turmoil had ended, and the last reports were being completed. Officially, the 8 fugitives were processed and placed under strict security in different cells. They weren't merely inmates this time. They served as illustrations. With an ice pack applied to her damaged knuckles, Alexis sat in the corner office. Now the ache was dim, a faraway remembrance of all that had transpired. She was still thinking about the last fight. The way they had fought as if they still thought they could win, Dominic's haughtiness, and Morgan's desperate expression. During their whole escape, they believed they were untouchable, faster, smarter, and that the system would pause long enough for them to permanently disappear. They had been mistaken. Carter watched her, as he often did after a case like this, leaning against the doorway across from her with his arms folded. "When you take down a whole fugitive operation, most people celebrate," he added. "You simply appear enraged." They nearly escaped, so Alexis let out a deep exhale. Carter remained silent. It was true, and they both knew it. 8 vicious men would be free right now, slipping into new lives with new names, ready to start over someplace else, if she hadn't fled that night, if she hadn't fought back in the woods, or if she hadn't tracked them down herself. Rather, they were shackled once more. And this time, behind them, the door was being welded shut. She flexed her fingers and put down the ice pack. "They're not going to go again, are they?" Carter shook his head and released a little breath. "No way. Even their initial sentences were awful. They are now considering life. No parole. Most of them are solitary. They would have been buried by federal escape charges alone. But they will never see the outside world again because of what they did." Alexis took that in with a single nod. "Excellent." According to Carter, they also strengthened security for upcoming transfers. The manner in which these men emerged. That won't occur once more. Not for them. Not for everyone. That was the important thing. They weren't simply imprisoned. They were done. Another escape attempt was out of the question. No more gaps. No more contacts who are hidden and waiting to be revealed. Collins had destroyed the whole network he had established to support them. Now, there would be only one obvious warning for any judge or warden who glanced at their files. There is no second chance for these folks. In that final instant, Vinny had sneered at her, believing he could still maintain some kind of control. In actuality, though, he had lost the moment they were taken back into custody. Carter's head cocked slightly. "Alexis, you ought to let this one go. It's finished." The coffee cup was still just warm against her palms as she gazed down at it for a while. "Yeah," she finally said. "I am aware." She was aware of something else, though. More would constantly come. It wasn't just Vinny who believed he was superior to the system. It wouldn't be him alone. Only someone who was prepared to track them down, pull them back, and ensure they never had another chance to flee stood between men like him and the people they harmed. She had not finished. She would never be. Alexis sipped her coffee slowly as she allowed the silence to descend upon her. The battle was over. The battle was over. However, she would always be prepared for the next one. I hope the story was enjoyable to you. To ensure you don't miss the next one, kindly subscribe and share it with your friends. I've chosen 2 stories for you to read in the interim that I believe you will like. Enjoy your wonderful day.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.